Hey everybody, I'm glad you're with me today, but if you came here to hear a sermon, this podcast is the wrong place. This is actually an essay. In fact, this is a political essay. It's called Politics: Why We All Are Wrong, but the United States is pretty correct. And practical steps you and I can take to help reduce the division in our country. Let me give you the premise so you can decide if you want to listen to the rest of this, because it's pretty long. Here's the premise. If you think the reasonable people are the people who think like you are wrong and you are part of the problem. How's that for a real great trailer to get you excited? Well, one of the benefits, or maybe the liabilities, of being a pastor is that you get to hear a wide range of political opinions from people. I mean, as wide as it gets, from the very far left to the very far right and everything in between. I get to be friends with good, kind, compassionate people who have very different ideas about politics. I also get to meet with a lot of crazy people. Now, if you know me, you know that I think that we should keep politics out of the church and Sunday morning worship as much as possible. And there are two reasons for this. The first is that a church community is one of those very rare places where people with very different political views can come together and be friends and possibly even learn from each other. This is getting rarer and rarer in our society. And this is something I love about our particular church. This function of bringing diverse people together is even more crucial in a deeply divided nation. It's a chance to see those on the other side as actual human beings rather than the caricatures that we see on our screens. And it can only happen if our church culture feels approximately fair, approximately even-handed to all sides of the political spectrum. Second, and even more important to me, politics and the lordship of Jesus Christ are two totally different categories. There is a word for elevating the importance of politics to the same level as the worship of God. It's called idolatry. It's called blasphemy. Whenever church and state mix, it's always the church that loses. And so the pulpit should never be used to endorse a particular political party. However, in the last several years, politics has so invaded our everyday lives, it has so invaded people's hearts, that I think it is necessary to talk about it, because the gospel of Jesus Christ really does apply to all areas of life. I don't think I'm trying to bring politics into the church as much as I'm trying to help our community process the politics that has already invaded us. But I also want this podcast to make sense to people regardless of whether they have any religious belief or not. I'm hoping what I say makes as much sense to a Christian and a Buddhist and an atheist and a nothing, wherever you are today. I also have a feeling it will annoy you wherever you are today, but I'm also hoping that you're going to hear at least a couple things that could maybe help you be part of the solution of this terrible division in our country. So, I'm taking off my pastor hat and I'm putting on my American citizen hat, and I'm limiting my speech just to the realm of human politics in the hopes of finding common ground with my neighbors. So, what is our situation? All of us think we are informed, but virtually none of us are. I put myself in this category. Here are two quick checkpoints to see if you are reasonably informed so that you can understand what is being played out in our nation. Here are two simple tests. First, think about the far left and the far right. How would you define them? What would be three characteristics of the far right? What would be a sign that someone is in the far right camp? What is a belief statement or a conviction they hold? Okay, now, what would be three characteristics of the far left? I'm not asking you to come up with three labels for them. I'm asking you to come up with 3 truth statements they would make. In other words, they would say, we believe A, we believe B, we believe C. Truth statements that those people would claim. Now, if you can't name at least 3 characteristics, that's not a very high bar. So if you can't even do that, on what grounds do you think you have any idea what is going on when people talk about right-wing extremists or Antifa? Second, and I know this is going to be a bummer to some of you, especially if you're a boomer, especially those of you who still hold a modernist worldview, who believe in classical liberalism, who are not familiar with the implications of hardcore postmodern thought, who think that people still think the way they did back in 1980. I need to state to you what for some of us is obvious. The thought leaders of the movement you most align with, so whether you say I'm mostly conservative or mostly progressive, the thought leaders of your movement don't believe in science, and they don't believe that skepticism and empirical data are the best way to understand the world and set policy. So if you're a conservative, you need to know that the far right and white supremacists do not believe in science or believe in skepticism and empirical data. They believe in a compelling narrative, and they believe in power. And if you're a progressive, you need to know that your thought leaders in what is known as critical theory, which is the grandchild of postmodern theory, they don't believe in science or skepticism or making decisions based on empirical data either. They believe in compelling narrative, and they believe in power. This is really important to grasp. This is not a battle between normal people and those crazy people. This is not a battle between people who believe in science and people who believe in myths. This is 2 primitive tribes fighting for supremacy. This is a loss of ground of like 400 years of progress. This is a step back to the religious wars of the 1600s. Now note I said the progressive thought leaders and conservative thought leaders. I didn't say the politicians. The politicians tend to trail behind. They themselves might be more moderate. After all, they need to win more votes, and they may not even understand the theoretical framework at work. But I promise you, if you look deep enough at the thought leaders of the BLM movement, found mostly in the academy and centered on critical theory, or groups like the actual alt-right, who are the grandchildren of the Nazis, you'll find they don't care about rational debate. They don't care what the data says. They don't believe in empirical data. They don't believe in the scientific method that brought us this modern miracle of multiple vaccines in record time. For both extremes, in the end, all there is power, so we might as well be the ones who hold it. Now, if you find it hard to believe that the extreme that you're most drawn to really rejects objective truth and the scientific method, please reach out to me, and I will be glad to send you not critiques of your side, but actual thought leaders from your side. And the reason a small little hobbit like me is making this podcast is not that I think that I have all the answers, but rather because I have a very realistic concern. The more you see the outrageous behavior of the other side, the more you're willing to give the extreme on your side a pass. The more plausible they seem to you, the more you will be tempted to move closer to your extreme. In other words, the more conservative you are, the more outrageous the things are you see progressives doing, the more you will give in to conservative extremists. And if you lean progressive, the more outrageous things you see conservatives doing, the more you will give progressive extremists a pass and perhaps even lean in a little to them. I need to say this one more time. If you think that this is a battle between normal people and crazy people, you actually don't know what planet you are living on, or at least you don't know what time you are living in. This is a battle between 2 primitive tribes who have used our freedom and the machinery of our own democracy against us in order to destroy that democracy. In many ways, the far right and the far left are like the coronavirus. They use the very wonderful machinery of our democracy against us to destroy our democracy the way a virus hijacks the machinery of our cells and turns them against us. If you think only one side is doing this, you are in grave danger. And worse, you are part of the problem. What we are dealing with here is a two-headed hydra that dresses itself up in science or patriotism and has absolutely nothing to do with either. It dresses itself up in justice or rules of law and has absolutely nothing to do with either. It has no place for reasonable people who are willing to compromise. The secret you cannot be allowed to know is that you have much more in common with the moderate people on the other side than you do with the extremes on your side. Because your extreme, like their extreme, demands absolute loyalty and will destroy anyone found wandering and call them abetting the enemy, even though that enemy is actually the other head of itself. In this way, by having two heads, one on either side, it gets to consume us whichever way we run. Do you see how wicked and precarious our situation is? Now, of course, if you're a logical and empirical data-driven person, you may be annoyed that I just used narrative imagery to make my point. A hydra may be colorful, but it added nothing to the validity of my argument. I agree. But it's not all about you. We have a lot of good neighbors who think more in terms of story and narrative. So if you need to boil down the last couple paragraphs to a logical proposition, it would be this. This guy thinks we are in a really serious situation where passions rather than logic is driving us, and he's afraid that calmer heads will not prevail. I know progressives who tell me that the majority of conservatives are hateful, stupid, fearful dolts, Nazis, and white supremacists who are willing to use violence to overthrow our democracy. I know conservatives that tell me that the majority of progressives are hateful, stupid, fearful dolts, Marxists who are willing to use violence to overthrow our democracy. Which one is right? There is a fatal flaw. One word they both used in those descriptions above that ruined their argument and is ruining our country. And we'll get to that. But first, let's take some cheap shots first, because according to our news feeds, that's what we really like the most. You could argue that progressives are now the new fundamentalists, and conservatives are the new elitists. The progressives are the new fundamentalists with their call-out culture of anyone who dares to wander from their very rigid, very narrow, politically correct morality. They use shame and power to silence their opponents. They have purity codes. They are living in a bubble where all their friends look and think the same as them. They are rigid bigots and they don't even know it. You could argue that conservatives are the new elitists. They're oblivious and cut off from the woes and the suffering of the urban poor. They are isolated from and so ignorant of other ways of thinking and knowing. They reduce life down to money and property and accumulating stuff. They are living in a bubble where all their friends look and think the same as them. They are rigid bigots and they don't even know it. And you could argue that moderates are cowards who refuse to take a stand, refuse to get their hands dirty, who sit back and make commentary, smugly acting above it all while the world goes to hell. Are any of these descriptions fair? Have I annoyed you? Haven't I really helped the situation by using all those labels? And yet, what is CNN and Fox News and our other self-customized news feeds full of? Such descriptions of the other side, but never about us. In fact, if you look at the news, most of it is about outrage about what the other side's latest atrocity is, and very little positive about your side. This summer, I had people who were aggravated at me as a pastor that I did not speak out more forcefully against police brutality during some BLM protests. I also had people who were aggravated that I didn't speak out more forcefully against the violence, destruction, and bullying that occurred at some BLM protests. And this week, I had some people who were aggravated at me that I did not speak out more forcefully against the violence, destruction, and bullying that occurred at the MAGA protest last Wednesday. I have people who are outraged that I would make any moral equivalence between MAGA gatherings and BLM gatherings. But if that's you, you need to know something. You need to know that the people on the other side are saying the exact same thing to me in the opposite direction. So, who should I listen to? Let's take last Wednesday as an example. After the storming of the Capitol, I posted on Facebook that I was trying to understand how many people were actually at that protest in D.C., and of them, what percentage of them actually participated in breaking the law and storming the Capitol. Within minutes of each other, I received 2 Facebook messages explaining what happened. They were up on my screen side by side. The first one was from an old friend who is a progressive. He said this: "These people were Nazis. Anyone who went to D.C. to support the president was involved in an attack on our nation. No comparison to any civil rights protest is valid. They are enablers and they are participants. It was an organized attack on our nation, a threat from within, as white nationalism has always been and continues to be. What we saw on Wednesday was a modern equivalent of Hitler's brown shirts. If you cannot condemn them, then you are complicit." The other post was from an old friend who is a conservative. And here's what she wrote. "Replying to your post, I will not post this on Facebook. As someone who was there in Washington at the MAGA rally, I have never felt so comfortable in that large of a crowd. I do not like crowds. The melting pot of America was there. All colors, ages, black, white, Latino, Asian. There was a very heavy Asian presence. There were Chinese getting signatures on petitions to stop the CCP. There were all types of people there. Hair colors, tats, piercings, etc. You know what I mean. We were there from 8 till probably 3-ish, when the sirens started going off. The breach was very strange, as it appeared that they were welcomed in and doors were being held open for them, etc. I don't know what went down, but there definitely had to be other influences in the mix. I'm bad with crowd size, but it was massive. We were under the impression that we were just going to march around the Capitol, kind of like marching around Jericho. No one said anything about going in. That was nuts. It was more of a party atmosphere, music, etc. The police were super friendly, smiling, taking pictures with people. We were thanking them for being there, and they were all saying, "You're welcome." Okay, so those are the 2 posts I was given. So which one of them is more accurate? Which one of them should I believe? Further, does whatever news feed you watch give you both of these perspectives so that you can decide for yourself how to interpret the actual events of that day? Or do they feed you one simplified narrative, which is the one you wanted to believe anyway? If this second case is the truth, what are you going to do about it? I could have done the exact same thing with comments I got during the protests this summer with Black Lives Matter. If your newsfeed was only showing you the worst of the worst, these violent people accosting innocent people on the street, beating them up, breaking into buildings, setting them on fire, destroying people's livelihoods, do you know what my friends who actually attended Black Lives Matter would say about that? See the show notes in this podcast for 2 resources that attempt to bring multiple perspectives to the table. Obviously, everyone who accosted the police or violated the Capitol perimeter must be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Obviously, trying to disrupt the proceedings of our democracy is a literal attack on our democracy. It was terrible and it's indefensible. But here's the thing. I know people who rightly condemn the shocking image of a man illegally sitting in Nancy Pelosi's desk. Did you see that? It was disgusting. But those same people were completely silent when protesters took over the Senate offices during the Brett Kavanaugh hearing and took over Senator Greasley's office. I know people who were horrified at what was done to Senator Greasley's office during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings and spoke out, but who are silent or even offering excuses for what happened last week. There is not one of us who is consistent. There is not one of us who is not a hypocrite. Let me try this experiment with you just to prove it, because you may be annoyed by what I just said, okay? Just listen to how your gut reacted to those two offices being violated. These two offices of our two elected officials were violated. Forget everything else that happened, every other person that was involved in other things. Just focus on the fact that these two elected officers, these two elected officials, had their space, had their office violated. Do those two violations feel exactly the same in your gut? Even if your mind is telling you, well, of course they're exactly the same, do they feel the same in your gut? We are seeing the same reality, but interpreting it in two very different ways. I know progressives who think we are living in 1984. That conservatives are so deceived, so blinded, so manipulated by their handlers. It's like they're living in the Matrix and they don't even know it. I know conservatives who think we are living in 1984. That progressives are so deceived, so blinded, so manipulated by their handlers. It's like they're living in the Matrix and they don't even know it. So what is reality? How do we take the red pill? In the movie The Matrix, the hero is offered a choice. Morpheus says to Neo, here's your choice. Take the blue pill and remain a slave to illusion. Take the red pill and become a slave to reality. Man, do I love that quote. Notice he doesn't say that reality will be pleasant or easy or make us feel good about ourselves. There are two main things that contribute to the Matrix effect. First, we human beings have a really hard time holding two ideas in our head at the same time. We can't see how two things could both be true at the same time. We want a smooth narrative where everything makes sense and holds together. How could Donald Trump be terrible and the media be terrible both at the same time? How could evil, violent ideologues and nice, kind, peaceful people with no ill will towards anyone be part of the same protest? Whether it is left-wing or a right-wing protest. So many times we see things as A or B, when in reality the situation is A and B. We don't want reality. Reality is confusing and messy and disjointed. We want a narrative where all the pieces fit together and add up and point to a simple conclusion. And we want it so bad, both conservatives and progressives, that we would rather live in the matrix of the echo chamber of our tribe than live in reality. Second, both sides tell us that we have to choose. They hold up a monstrous caricature of the other side. They pretend the extreme fringe is what everyone who leans 1 degree away from your side believes. Like there are no individuals with their own opinions, just one horrible monolithic block. And they say, you don't want to be this, do you? You don't want to be a hateful communist who wants to destroy all that's great about America, do you? You don't want to be a hateful Nazi who hates people of other races, do you? Well, if you're not with us, then you are with them. If you don't take a stand with us, then you're aiding them. You're complicit. That's a lie. There is a word for that argument. It's called propaganda. It's a logical fallacy called the straw man effect. This is exactly how actual Nazis talked, and then they went on to slaughter millions of innocents. This is exactly how actual communists talk, and they went on to slaughter millions of innocents. Are you going to be more loyal to your tribe or the Constitution of the United States? The United States is built around the concept of the individual, not the tribe. It is not being cowardly. It is being brave and logical to say, well, I agree with you on these 3 points, but I think you're dead wrong on those other 3 points. And further, as I look at the other side that you say is so terrible, I think they are actually right on a couple of these points, though I think they're absolutely wrong on these other points. This isn't being complicit, it's using your head. We act like the other side has to be 100% right and 100% pure, or otherwise they are completely terrible. And it's okay for our side to break the law because we're justified, because they're the bad guys. The opposite is the truth. In the United States, you are allowed to be wrong. You are allowed to believe anything you want, but you're not allowed to break the law. People are allowed to be wrong in America, but we are more offended by the other side being wrong than we are in our side breaking the law. That's when you know you're living in the Matrix. Well, how do we take the red pill? Unfortunately, it's much more complicated than taking one pill. But instead of a red pill, I'm going to give you 4 assumptions, 4 presuppositions that I am trying to use to analyze any event in our country. And I think these 4 things will help us do a better job living in red pill world instead of blue pill world. So the first assumption is this: there are real Nazis in our country. There are real Marxists in our country. They really do want to destroy our capitalist democratic republic, and they are willing to use violence to achieve their ends. They hate what the United States stands for. This is not a conclusion I'm inferring. This comes from their actual words, what they freely admit themselves. They think our country is so messed up that a violent revolution is justified. Therefore, there are real threats to our country. We can't turn a blind eye to them and pretend everything's okay. We do have to take that seriously. My second assumption is this: there are real powers at work, including foreign nations, that want us to hate, despise, and mistrust each other. It doesn't really matter to them which side is right, so long as we are growing more disgusted, more angry, more suspicious of our neighbors, more willing to attack those who disagree with us. Any of that happens, they're winning. A divided America is a weak, blind, pathetic America that can be exploited for their own gain. My third assumption is this: in the end, there are really only 2 options. Either A, about half the country has lost their minds. Half the country are hateful, stupid, fearful jerks. Half the country is the problem, and they must be stopped. They must be re-educated or expunged or at least silenced by the good people who happen to be us. Or B, the second option is that about half of all the people in America, about half of the most informed, intelligent, kind, compassionate, thoughtful people in America think you are dead wrong. And in fact, that your ideas are a threat to everything that is great about America. Or at least they have the potential to lead downhill to really ruining our country. Now, if A is right, if half the country really are hateful, stupid, fearful jerks, it's all over anyway. You might as well find another country because you will never turn that many people around. It's hopeless, and civil war is inevitable. That is, if it is true. Rather, I think that many of us would rather be hopeless based on a lie than endure the pain of facing a difficult truth. I think that most of us cannot tolerate the idea that any smart, kind, informed, compassionate, patriotic person could possibly disagree with us. So we would rather believe option A, which is a lie, which makes us feel good about ourselves, than believe option B, which is the truth and makes us feel unsettled about ourselves. Because it means we could be wrong. And who wants to admit that? So is there any good news here? Yes, there is. At the very core, BLM and MAGA protesters really do have something very primal in common, and it's good. They think there is too much unfairness and dishonesty in our country, and they want to do something about it. Let me say that again. If you strip down all the rhetoric and all the implications and all the policies and all the conclusions, if you strip all that back, what you find is both BLM supporters and MAGA supporters both believe that there is too much unfairness in our country and dishonesty in our country, and they want to do something about it. Now, isn't that motive a good thing? If you immediately jump to the thought, there is no comparison between those two, I'm sorry, but that tells me that you're part of the problem. Don't you get that's exactly what the people on the other side are saying too? Can we start with the idea that the motivation to want to make our country more fair and more honest is a really good thing? That's a good intention. Now, good intentions can be manipulated by evil leaders to bring about terrible results. But the desire for more fairness and more honesty is a good desire. You might think their priorities, solutions, policies, and actions, the ones the other side takes to try and get what they want, are terrible or wrong-headed or even dangerous. But can you affirm that their desire for more fairness or honesty is a good thing, regardless of how hypocritical you think they are? Well, if there are some good desires and intentions on both sides, why can't we all get along? And that brings me to my fourth and final assumption. Why? Because we allow the voices on our side, the side of reason and goodness, to convince us to think the worst of those who disagree with us and to look the other way when the people on our side do wrong things. We allow voices on our side to convince us to think the worst of those who disagree with us and to look the other way when people on our side do wrong things. Are there real Marxists in the BLM movement that believe it is okay to use violence to tear down our system? Yes, of course, they've said so. But can you accept the fact that the vast majority of people in the BLM movement are not that? Are there real white supremacists and Nazis in the MAGA movement who think it's okay to use violence to tear down our system? Yes, they've said so. But can you accept the fact that the vast majority of people in the MAGA movement are not that? And in both cases, that 90% aren't lemmings, they aren't fools, they are individuals with their own ideas and their own convictions. They are your fellow Americans. But some will say, how dare you say this? How dare you say there's a moral equivalence between these two movements? You should never be tolerant of the intolerant. Are you saying there's no good or evil, just a difference of opinion? Are you saying there's no difference between good people and bad people? No, I'm saying that all of us have the capacity to be really, really bad people. Think of every minority and every majority group in our country, whether it's by race or income or politics or culture, every one of them, if pushed to the limit, if convinced that the system is rigged against them, has the capacity to go out with torches and pitchforks. Does that justify it? No. Does it make it understandable? Yes. Are any of us tempted to do that? You bet we are. If you have ever seen a mob in action, there are few things more evil And every one of us has the capacity to join a mob. It just has to be the right buttons get pushed. And this is exactly why the United States of America is so brilliant and so worthy of protection. The United States was not primarily set up to protect good people from the bad people. It was set up to protect us from our own worst inclinations. The framers were most worried about two things: tyrants and factions. Factions are a majority or a minority who think that their cause is so just that they have the right to take the law into their own hands. Again, the idea of the United States was not that there were good guys and bad guys, but rather that people of goodwill could totally disagree about politics, about policies, about priorities. And the framers realized that if the system did not feel fair enough to all groups, to all factions, then the worst elements of those factions could end up leading the whole into violence, insurrection, and anarchy. Mob rule, might makes right, inciting factions to violence is exactly what our Constitution and form of government was designed to oppose and diffuse. And that diffusing aspect is even the most important part. The way a flexible, soft pillow can take a blow, but a beautiful porcelain vase will be smashed by the same blow. Our country is based on a set of ideas, not might makes right, not even pure democracy. No, it's not a pure democracy in the sense that everybody gets to vote on everything. No, we have a representative form of government. Why? To diffuse passions. You see, the problem with being a passionate person, it's beautiful to be a passionate person, but the problem with being a passionate person is you can end up getting ruled by your passions, and when that happens, bad things happen. We don't all vote to make the rules. We vote on people to represent us to make the rules. We don't all vote for the president. We vote on electors to represent us to elect the president. And all of these things that might seem old-fashioned and archaic and weird to you, they're actually brilliant. They're designed to handle and take into account human nature and passion and restrain those things from destroying the very freedom and liberty that a mob thinks they're standing up for. Our country is based on a set of ideas, not might makes right, not any particular party or any particular leader. I love our nation and I believe in our nation because it has built into its very DNA, has built into its very structure, the ability to redeem and reform and improve itself. It's built in to the system. Having individual states, having an electoral college, having 3 branches of government, these aren't quirky artifacts from the past. They were designed exactly so that we could handle situations like the one we experienced last Wednesday. So now I've come to the point that I believe something I never would have imagined I would have believed when I was younger. I believe protecting the process is more important than the results the process gives me. I would rather have a process that is approximately, crudely, roughly fair and abides by the rule of law, even if I think the results that process gives me are terrible for me or terrible for the country. Because if we don't have the process, we don't have anything. Terrible results today are much better than a terrible process tomorrow. Because what follows a terrible process tomorrow are much more terrible results the next day. Have you ever been to a third world nation? Have you ever been to a dictatorship or lived under communist rule? If you have only experienced this country, how could you possibly know how good or how bad it is? Just this year, I've had the opportunity to have conversations with people who've come from all of those situations, and they all say, "You have no idea what you've got here. You have no idea how bad it could get." So yes, I totally believe in the experiment known as the United States of America, and I completely reject any on the left or any on the right that would try and destroy that system. Now, when I say I believe in the United States, I don't mean that the same way I say I believe in God. No, no nation, no man-made cause deserves that level of veneration or devotion. Rather, I mean, of all the distorted political contraptions made by human beings, of all the imperfect political contraptions made by sinful, prideful, greedy, selfish, imperfect, broken, fickle, untrustworthy creatures like you and me, this one's pretty amazing. Is it perfect? No. Does it need reformation? Absolutely. But in the last year, we have heard both those on the far left and those on the far right say, tear the whole system down. We've waited long enough. It's not working. Blow it up. And if you haven't heard both sides say that, you haven't read enough. There's a word for that mentality. It's called insanity. What other government in any moment of history or in any part of the world can compare to this set of ideas, however imperfectly we might live them out? What example do you have of something better? Really? One example that actually exists. I don't mean the nirvana in your head, and it only exists in your head. I mean an example that exists in the real messy horror of how real human beings actually behave. What other country, not just now, but ever? And by the way, no, you don't get to say Sweden or Finland. You don't get to compare us to some small, homogeneous, rich country. And by the way, all those countries would be either speaking German or Russian by now if they'd been left alone to themselves. No, you need to compare us to a superpower, either in the present or in the past. A country with a huge... No, you need to compare us to a superpower. A country that has huge urban cities, but also has huge rural areas. A sprawling country that includes diverse people groups and cultures and is powerful enough and big enough that other countries look to it for protection. Would you really rather live in the Soviet Union in 1960? Would you really rather live in China today or in ancient Rome 2,000 years ago? Really? If you despise the ideals and the design of this system, if you want to remake this country in the image of your ideology, you are the problem. The whole purpose of this country was to be able to support multiple ideologies. Our country is about a process that allows people to disagree without destroying each other. Okay, well then how do we heal and bring the country together? With more control? By limiting free speech? By clamping down on the rights of those we view as the problem? No, when you do that, you create two more problems that are worse than the first. First, you remove the pressure relief valve and so increase the odds that the melting pot, which is also a pressure cooker, is going to blow up. One of the ways we vent our anger at injustice, and there's always going to be injustice, by the way, because there's always going to be people, and laws can restrain injustice but never fully eliminate it without eliminating people. Free speech allows us to vent our anger through words rather than through violence. We all need to be able to speak our mind. And our society needs that relief valve to divert anger into words instead of into violence. Remember again the difference between hitting a pillow, which lives to see another day, and hitting a ceramic pot, which is destroyed forever because it can't handle the blow. Second, when you clamp down on speech or do anything that seems grossly unfair to one side, you just throw gas on the fire. You give credibility to the extremists among them who can then say, see, we were right. They are oppressing us. The system is rigged. They're trying to take away our rights. So now the only solution is to rise up and fight back. And those extremists are on the left and they're on the right and they're everywhere. But they are a minority. Another way to put all this is this. We all suck. We all want to believe in our own righteousness and virtue. There is no safe port from hypocrisy. There is no safe port from arrogance. It's not just that the far right and the far left suck. Me thinking I'm so wise sitting in the middle place of moderation, I suck too. We all have the capacity to reduce those who disagree with us into ugly caricatures. We are all tempted to live in the matrix that tells us that we are the good guys and therefore anyone who disagrees with us must be a bad guy. It's not that there aren't bad guys, but the idea that anyone who thinks you're completely wrong is a bad guy is a lie. And it's oh so much more comfortable living there than in the rough, messy, unflattering place called reality. When I look at how quick I have been to assume the worst, to use a harsh tone, to label people in my mind, I am ashamed and convicted, and I should be. You see, it's exactly because we all have the capacity to do terrible things, to take our ideas too far, to jump on the bandwagon, and to think that our righteous cause justifies trampling the rights of others because they're not good people anyway. It is exactly because all of us suck that we need our Constitution. We need a Constitution like the United States of America to keep us from veering off into one extreme or another. If you think that the basic ideas of the other extreme are far worse than the basic ideas of the extreme on your side, you are the problem. Even a short study of the political left and political right will show you they both end up in the exact same place if you let them. Totalitarian government led either by a charismatic tyrant or a faceless committee that tramples the rights of the individual and brings economic and cultural ruin. In short, they both end up in the greatest horrors that have ever been known to mankind. If you are not equally terrified of the far left and the far right, you are part of the problem. Now, at any given moment in time, they are equally evil, but they are not equally dangerous. Here's what I mean. Whichever one has more cultural credibility is more dangerous because it has more power and therefore can more easily silence dissent. It can rewrite history. Whichever side can control the narrative is the more dangerous one in a particular given moment of time. But things swing back and forth like a pendulum in different generations. So, for example, if you think about the 1950s versus today, you will see how that cultural power has shifted back and forth between the right and the left over time. Whichever one has the dominance in the narrative-making areas, which would be the academy, the news, the media, entertainment, at a given time, we need to recognize that they have more power to control the narrative. And this swings back and forth through time, but we need to be aware of the time that we're living in and act accordingly. So what do you do if you really don't want to be part of the problem? I want to give you 4 ideas, 4 things that I'm not doing very well myself, but I'm trying to do myself. First, get honest about how much of the problem you are. Here's a quick test that will show you how much of the problem you are. So, if you lean conservative, write down 3 valid arguments or concerns that Black Lives Matter protesters have. You don't have to agree with some of their actions or some of their policy demands, but write down 3 concerns they have that you can say, hey, I might not agree with all their actions or their proposed solutions, but this is a legitimate concern. I can understand why someone would care about that. So, for an example, if you can't say, I agree with them that black and white people should be treated with equal dignity, and that we need to fight real racism. Man, if you can't agree with that, then honestly, I don't know what to say. If you lean progressive, do the same 3 things for the MAGA protesters. You don't have to agree with some of their actions or some of their policy demands, but write down 3 concerns that they have that you can say, I might not agree with their actions or some of their actions or some of their proposed solutions, but that right there, that's a legitimate concern. I can understand why someone would care about that. So, for example, if you can't say, I agree with them that the full Bill of Rights should be vigorously defended and that we should fight real voter fraud. Man, if you can't agree with that, honestly, I don't know what to say. I am not asking you to validate the extreme left or the extreme right. They're both nuts. I'm asking you to validate the vast majority of reasonable people who happen to disagree with you. Think of an average MAGA person that you know personally, or an average BLM person that you know personally. So what 3 things would you say? And you can even steal my example for one of yours, so now you only have to come up with 2. And by the way, if you don't personally know these people and are depending on your screen to tell you what they are like, you have a real problem on your hands. And I want to ask you this. When are you going to take the initiative to reach out to someone in that camp and ask them to have a one-on-one conversation until you can identify at least 3 valid concerns they have? If you can't do that, I think you are part of the problem, and you really shouldn't be talking to the rest of us because you don't know what you're talking about yet. Second, we need to give each other more slack. Now, I just didn't give you very much slack right then, right? So I repent of that. That's not cool. All right? We need to give each other a lot more slack. Stop with the hyperbole. Stop with the labels. Stop with the demanding complete conformance. Stop with the call-out culture. Catching people. Tolerance is putting up with the things you disagree with, not marching with people you do agree with. Do you have to tolerate everything? No, you don't have to tolerate people breaking the law, but you have to tolerate just about everything else. The law was developed democratically by the people for the people. It's not perfect, but it's as good as we get. You don't have to tolerate someone breaking the law. And you might say, well, that's not enough. I mean, there's plenty of immoral things that aren't against the law. You might think a particular act is immoral. But all you can really expect of your fellow citizen is that they follow the law. That has to be good enough for you. That's what I mean by slack. Don't be a busybody in other people's business. Let them do things you disagree with. And if our laws are wrong or unjust or need changing, you work within the system to change those laws. And if enough of your fellow citizens agree with you, it will become the law. And if they don't, you still get to have your opinion, but you don't get to force it upon the rest of us. What I call justice, my neighbor might call oppression. In a democratic republic, you don't always get your way. It's imperfect, but it's far better than any of the alternatives. You may have heard it said that we don't expect enough of each other. I think in a social media age, we expect too much of each other. We know too much of what is in other people's heads, and then we think we have the right to pass judgment on stuff we were never really meant to see or have access to in the first place. Sure, it's their fault for posting it, but it's your fault for indulging it too. We need to correct each other a whole lot less. We need to tolerate a whole lot of stuff that makes us shake our heads. Otherwise, why shouldn't the other side impose their will on us just like we want to impose our will on them? Third, we need to consume less media and less social media. A recent study, and I'll put a link in the show notes about it, a recent study concluded that ironically, it was the people who consumed the most news and the most social media that had the most distorted views of those who opposed them. And even if you take social media out, it was the people that thought they were the most informed and spent the most time consuming news who actually had the most distorted view of what was going on. They viewed people who opposed them as far more radical and far more extreme than they really were. They took the whole group on the other side and lumped them in the extreme category, when really there was a wide range of beliefs among Democrats, among Republicans, among independents. Even on issues like gun control or abortion, these hot topics, there was a wide range of belief in all these groups. This overconsumption is part of the heart of the problem. And honestly, you guys, this is a difficult one for me because I'm really interested in the news and I'm really interested in politics. But I am seeing more and more that it is acting more like a drug, and I am acting more and more like an addict. I heard one thinker say this week, it's great to be passionate, but the problem with passionate people is that they are easily ruled by their passions, and it never ends well. What discipline can you put in your life to get the most extreme voices of both sides out of your head? How can you get the news without getting suckered by the clickbait? What media source seems relatively balanced to you but also annoys you about 1/3 of the time? That's a good place to begin. I'm going to include links to 2 websites that are possible resources for you to do that. But I got to warn you, you'll find them boring. They won't give you the adrenaline rush you're used to. They won't be as entertaining or as slick as the other news sources. You'll have to work harder and think more and have less of a sense of resolution and assurance, because that is what real news is actually like. And then finally, fourth, we end up at the beginning where we started. We need to stop doing the very thing we are most prone to do, which is listen to those voices on our side which make us think the worst of our opponents and which look the other way when someone on our side does wrong. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, I find this really, really hard. Sometimes I get so outraged by the other side that I think that if I give them even an inch, if I point out any failure on, quote, our side, that they then will use it to say, see, we were right all along, and this now justifies everything else that we claim. It's really hard to do this, at least for me. Perhaps a step in that direction is to talk in a safe environment with same-minded people who want to hold each other accountable. In other words, you know that these people are not insane and they pretty much agree with you, and it's safe then to say, when so-and-so did X, that wasn't right, and we need to find a way to hold them accountable, to do it in that kind of environment. Because even that is significant, because you might impact the way your friends think, and that could be a really good thing. If you don't feel you can speak out against your own, then at least do number 2 above. Don't take cheap shots at the other side or make sweeping generalizations about them. Don't rub your victories in their face. Don't rub their side's latest outrage in their face. They're not in charge of it. At least keep your mouth shut if you can't say anything helpful. And obviously, I'm talking to myself right here. There are forces that want to tear our country apart. There are real dangers on the far left and the far right. But the vast majority of your fellow Americans really do just want to live and let live. They really do want fairness and honesty and equal rights for all. They may have different ideas about those things than you do, but they really don't wish you ill. That's got to be enough for you. Just them not wanting to wish you ill, that really does have to be enough. If you're holding them up to some moral standard of your own, outside the rule of law, I'm sorry, that is your problem. They do not wish you ill. They might be wrong, but they are not the devil. They don't want to trample your rights, and they don't want you to trample on their rights. In a fallen, broken world, you can't expect more than that out of them. If you demand that people agree with you, you expect too much, and they won't. Ever. Now, I know that this talk is very unsatisfying so far for some of you because I am not condemning something enough. I'm not calling out something enough. That's because I think we all have been doing way too much condemning and calling out. What is the natural result of feeling condemned or called out? More anger and more resentment. Oh, so we just do nothing about the injustices we see? No, I didn't say that. I said we do something other than our self-righteous indignation and name-calling and calling out. Our governmental system is not perfect, and yes, crooks and ideologues will exploit it from time to time, but as long as the large majority of us believe in it and actually support it, it has the ability to evolve and adapt and get better and better in a clunky, frustratingly slow way, sometimes swinging too far in one direction and other times swinging too far in the opposite direction. But over time, it seems to be able to correct itself. What other plan do you know of that self-corrects as well as our system of government? In a fallen, broken world, you can't expect more of a government than that. In conclusion, saying that America has real problems and injustices doesn't make you a traitor. Saying America is amazing and wonderful doesn't make you blind. Which one of those do you have more of a problem with? That's on you. It is exactly in emergencies where we are most tempted to infringe upon the Bill of Rights because we think others are either traitors or blind. And it is exactly then that we need to most protect the Bill of Rights for exactly the people that we can't stand. It is exactly in emergencies where we are tempted to look for someone to blame, to be a lynch mob, to want to purge and demand purity. But it is exactly then when we most need to protect the Bill of Rights for exactly the people that we can't stand. People demand swift action. Mobs with torches demand the swiftest action. Sometimes the inefficiency and the plotting nature of our form of government is its greatest virtue. Checks and balances are never efficient. That's the whole point. Fairness and equal rights is never efficient. So how does our discourse need to change? We need to focus more on the law and less on the personalities involved. Do we believe in the rule of law or the rule of men? I know people who say they believe in the rule of law, but then they focus on the personalities. They focus on the latest quote, the latest statement, the latest outrage. Yes, that person's words matter, but so do yours, and so do your thoughts. And my job and your job is to focus, for the sake of our neighbors, more on the rule of law than on who said what about who. If a person breaks a law, then they cross a boundary. Not your boundary, the people's boundary. The people have spoken through their government and call the government to execute judgment upon those who break the law. All you can expect of your neighbors is that they don't break the law. You may rightly want so much more of them, and there is so much more to life, and there is so much more to morality and flourishing, but you cannot demand more of them. If all of us were only judging each other by the rule of law right now and expecting nothing else of them, we would have nowhere near the division, nowhere near the violence, nowhere near the destruction, nowhere near the hate that we are experiencing now. We can expect so much more in the future if we would expect so much less now. Give your neighbors some slack. Don't call them out. Focus on the rule of law. And if the rules need changing or adapting, then get to work on that. It is not an easy or a simple thing to be living in a democratic republic, but it sure beats all the other alternatives. Let's give each other some slack and stand together defending the idea of America as we do the hard work of getting even closer to the ideal of America, which is one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thanks for taking the time to be with me. I know this wasn't easy. If you think I'm really off on something, let me know. And maybe the two of us can have a one-on-one. Thanks, you guys. This is Langdon Palmer signing off. And the next podcast you see on this site is going to be all about the gospel.